Thank you everyone in the back. Thank you very especially Maria and Vitka, and thank you all for coming and braving the storm to be here. I would like to begin with a short clip of Reagan's address at Moscow University in 1988, and then I will start my talk afterwards.
Standing here before a mural of your revolution, I want to talk about a very different revolution that is taking place right now, quietly sweeping the globe without bloodshed or conflict. Its effects are peaceful, but they will fundamentally alter our world, shatter old assumptions, and reshape our lives. It's easy to underestimate because it's not accompanied by banners or fanfare. It's been called the technological or information revolution. And as its emblem, one might take the tiny silicon chip, no bigger than a fingerprint. One of these chips has more computing power than a room full of old-style computers. As part of an exchange program, we now have an exhibition touring your country that shows how information technology is transforming our lives, replacing manual labor with robots, forecasting weather for farmers, or mapping the genetic code of DNA for medical researchers. These microcomputers today aid the design of everything from houses to cars to spacecraft. They even design better and faster computers. They can translate English into Russian, or enable the blind to read, or help Michael Jackson produce on one synthesizer the sounds of a whole orchestra. Linked by a network of satellites and fiber optic cables, one individual with a desktop computer and a telephone commands resources unavailable to the largest governments just a few years ago. Like a chrysalis, we're emerging from the economy of the Industrial Revolution, an economy confined to and limited by the Earth's physical resources, into, as one economist titled his book, The Economy in Mind, in which there are no bounds on human imagination, and the freedom to create is the most precious natural resource. Think of that little computer chip. Its value isn't in the sand from which it is made, but in the microscopic architecture designed into it by ingenious human minds. Or take the example of the satellite relaying this broadcast around the world, which replaces thousands of tons of copper mined from the earth and molded into wire. In the new economy, human invention increasingly makes physical resources obsolete. We're breaking through the material conditions of existence to a world where man creates his own destiny. Even as we explore the most advanced reaches of science, we're returning to the age-old wisdom of our culture, a wisdom contained in the book of the Genesis in the Bible. In the beginning was the Spirit, and it was from this Spirit that the material abundance of creation issued forth. But progress is not foreordained. The key is...
So this was Reagan's address on May 31st of 1988 at Moscow University, standing in front of a mural of the October Revolution. As you could see, and in Reagan's own words, he was pitting revolution against revolution. And he extolled the virtues of the tiny silicon chip, the emblem for the digital or informational revolution, which would allow humanity to break through the material conditions of existence and enter a dematerialized world of information and code. Like a chrysalis, Reagan argued, we are emerging from the economy of the Industrial Revolution, an economy confined to and limited by the Earth's physical resources, into, as one economist titled his book, the economy in mind, in which there are no bounds on human imagination, and the freedom to create is the most precious natural resource. Invoking the ancient wisdom of the Bible, Reagan concluded, in the beginning was the Spirit, and it was from this Spirit that the material abundance of creation issued forth. So now I'm going to fast forward to 2010, when roughly 2 decades later, on July 23rd, a user named Rocco posted a meandering speculation on the online forum Less Wrong, which is a community blog devoted to refining the art of human rationality. This is how they term their own mission, mission statement. The blog is run by the Bay Area investor and researcher Eliezer Jodorowsky, the co-founder of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. And in his post, Rocco hypothesized that a coming artificial intelligence, once invented or once in existence, might wish to retroactively punish the humans who did not knowingly contribute to its initial development. So this hypothetical artificial intelligence is omniscient because it would know categorically whether or not you have read Rocco's post, and it's also omnipotence. It would also categorically be able to resurrect you, or to resurrect your mind via digital simulation, and then proceed to torture you into eternity. Though Rocco's thought experiment sounds unhinged, his fears are allegedly sustained by Bayesian probability, a premise which instilled such horror in the minds of those who congregate at the forum that Eliezer Jodorowsky erased the threat and admonished Rocco to quit chattering. The erasure of this original threat did little to stop the story from spreading, however, and Rocco's artificial intelligence found a second life on Reddit, becoming a prominent avatar for the neoreactionary transhumanism popularly known as Rocco's Basilisk, or simply the Basilisk. So, needless to say, we are no longer living Reagan's dream. As it became apparent recently, the ethos of the tech industry transmogrified from the market-besotted optimism of Bill Gates to the digital feudalism represented by Bay Area neoreactionaries, neo-cameralists, and cyber-monarchists. Not incidentally, the ethno-nationalist blog More Right, run by the neo-reactionary and ethno-nationalist ideologue Michael Anisimov, emerged out of Less Wrong. And the neo-Nazi Daily Stormer gets most donations from Silicon Valley and Santa Clara County, home to Apple and Intel. Quoting from an interview in Mother Jones, according to the white supremacist Richard Spencer, the average alt-rightist is probably a 28-year-old tech-savvy guy working in information technology. It is unclear how Rocco's malevolent artificial intelligence came to be identified with the basilisk. The basilisk is a legendary crested snake-like being able to poison those unfortunate enough to catch his gaze. This beast, which dates back to ancient Greece, has been featured in Harry Potter and in a recent manga series. But the basilisk is also an age-old anti-Semitic trope, heavily mentioned in Martin Luther's On Jews and Their Lies, written in 1543. So this connection is, I would say, quite intentional. Commotion notwithstanding, it is hard to see how, exactly, Bayes' theorem might apply to Rocco's vengeful artificial intelligence. There is no prior manifestation or historical record of any kind of artificial intelligence, malevolent or otherwise. And in the absence of reliable data, any assumption about this artificial intelligence psychology would be fairly arbitrary. So, for everyone, those who, and I included since I tried to reproduce Rocco's calculations, seek mathematical proof of the prediction's likelihood, we are missing the point. The content of Rocco's thought is symbolic, not scientific. It speaks through cipher and allegory. The perplexing nature of this type of speculation emerging from transhumanists and effective altruists, Bay Area techno-libertarians, and artificial intelligence existential risk groups made me toy with the idea of surveying these blogs or online forums in a similar vein to what Klaus Teweleit did with the Diaries of the Freikorps in his seminal work Male Fantasies. And for those not familiar with Teweleit, in Male Fantasies he examined the diaries written by members of the Freikorps, which were the German paramilitary unit which refused to disarm after the World War I armistice. And he was stricken by the grotesque personifications of communism that abounded in these diaries. And these personifications, again, however grotesque, were not necessarily wrong or not necessarily false. In fact, they carry an element of truth, because war, however life-destroying, was for the Freikorps a livelihood or a means of life. And communism posed a very concrete threat to Prussian militarism and, by extension, to the lower ranks of the aristocracy that the Freikorps recruits typically belonged to. So they do carry an element of truth, but they also carry an element of drama. The word communism, Tevelite argues in these diaries, is never used to refer to a form of political economy entailing the collectivization of resources. Communism appears to be synonymous with castration, with the fear of being emasculated and rendered powerless, politically as well as sexually. And there's a comparable divide, if not an outright contrast, between the infrastructural or logistic dimension of artificial intelligence research, or what we call deep learning, and the commonplace fictionalization or personification of artificial intelligence. As you probably know, artificial intelligence in recent years took over Wall Street in every in-flight magazine as the new capitalist frontier. The global artificial intelligence market is expected to expand at the compound annual growth rate of 50.51% during the period from 2017 to 2021. In other words, artificial intelligence is at the moment the only fast-growing sector in the economy and the sole compelling attempt to project another phase of capitalist accumulation beyond the already exhausted neoliberal phase. From a market perspective, artificial intelligence is a reformist project. It promises to restore declining profit margins. But the gendering of deep learning does to artificial intelligence what porn does to sex. It renders it lurid. And I'm here paraphrasing, but also like betraying a sentence that Brian Dratcourt used to refer to post-internet art. But we are not going into that yet. The basilisk sprang from a long lineage of what one could call male personifications of artificial intelligence, which fit squarely into this antagonist matrix. Once self-aware, artificial intelligence takes on the mantle of the liberal self, autonomy, individualism, and self-possession, usurping control from humans, and the latter are forced into submission or face extinction. Female-gendered artificial intelligences have a completely different character. Can we have the PDF? Ta-da. I have it. In spite of the feminist appropriation of the cyborg-like body as a degendering machine, the cyborg became a reactionary figure which renders the female pliable to male desire. Bionics tends to follow bigotry, and eliding far past the near future, humanoid robots are gendered according to traditional roles. Military technology is male and service technology is female. Artificial intelligence, when female-gendered, has more to do with the relation between the male gaze and the female body than with the deep learning or neural networks. I'm just using these images to illustrate how there's a continuity. For instance, in this case, this is an anatomical Venus, and the way the female body is represented in this like female-gendered REs. Here, the yearning for an unresisting and unrejecting object fuels romantic or sexual fantasies, namely the fantasy of total penetration. And from Sherry 2000 to Her, female-gendered artificial intelligence are typically images of female subordination under the guise of an idealized womanhood. Within this regime of representation, to paraphrase Paul B. Preciado, masculinity is defined necropolitically by man's right to inflict death, while femininity is defined biopolitically, by women's obligation to serve men. In analog times, this obligation was first and foremost the obligation to bear children. But as evolutionary biology began to treat genetic information as an essential code, the very code of life, a semiotic slippage began to entangle computational code and biological semen as the bearer of the male issue. Whether this issue is a child or a vengeful artificial intelligence who punishes those who did not father him. From this perspective, the basilisk could be read as an allegory for the encroachment of necropower within the domain of biopolitics. But crested snakes aside, the alt-right or neoreactionary bestiary is full of liminal animals, amphibious, mucous creatures, frogs, basilisks, sea monsters, and species-bending entities like cats in military garb and other anthropomorphic critters. Now, I just have a couple of examples. Sorry. This is a new reactionary cat and a typical Pepe the Frog. The far right has traditionally preferred nobler animals like eagles or lions, and as Tevelite argued, the fascist imaginary detests all things murky and watery, typically conflating mass movements with floods, swamps, or pits of muck. Also, Giovanna just referred right now to the car crash and this feeling of disgust and some sort disgust entangled with some sort of like sexual variation about like the mud and gulping up this like muddy waters and then conflating it with the idea of the feminine and with the mother. The experience of industrialization was an experience of shock to both the social and to the individual body. The fascist, which is like the typical symbol of fascism, a bound bundle of wooden rods, symbolizes the armored or the hard drill formations of a military phalanx, a cipher for the fascist superbody, and the direct response to the fear of mutilation, of having the inner body's soft innards peeled by an industrial injury. And just as an aside, at the turn of the 19th century, 90% of surgeries that were practiced in hospitals were amputations due to industrial injuries, and this was during peace times. So this fear was of course like a very concrete and very real fear. Slimy frogs and chiseled marbles make for strange bedfellows. But last August 12th in Charlottesville, the national flag of Kyrgyzstan marched along with nationalist flags. Sorry. This is the national flag of Kyrgyzstan. Marched along with National Socialist flags, Deus Vult and iron crosses, swastikas, and Walnut symbols, making manifest the real affinity which lay behind the apparent contradiction between neoreactionaries and a loose coalition of white supremacists, old-school racists, Islamophobes, and anti-Semites. In my view, this points to a new configuration of fascist ideology taking shape under the edges of and working in tandem with neoliberal governance. Neoreaction, and just to explain briefly, is the brainchild of British philosopher turned ideologue Nick Land and Urbit owner Curtis Yarving, whose pen name is Mencius Molbuk. And it's a Silicon Valley-based ideology which champions opt-in societies or GovCorps, ideally run by a CEO king. Though they do not identify as neo-reactionaries, Balaji Srinivasan, Peter Thiel, and Patrick Friedman also advocate opt-ins that restrict citizenship rights to investors, the named stockholders, bearing stakeholders from representation. Under the GovCorp model, the state will no longer regulate capital, it will rather become capital's unfettered expression. Neo-reactionaries are, in this way, classic libertarians. They do not want to limit the power of the state, they just want to privatize it. The point is not, however, as Philip Sandifer already argued, to say that neoreactionaries are crypto-libertarians. Rather, it is to suggest that libertarianism is crypto-reactionary. Neoreaction represents the point where its benign mask starts to slip away, revealing its chauvinist nature. In other words, the stack could be said to be the new fascist. Instead of democratic rights, under the Govcorp model, people would have the right to leave. And Nick Land emphatically rejects the democratic concept of political representation, that is, the concept of having a voice, arguing that the only meaningful right is the right to exit. The right to exit is comparable to the idea of capital strike that was put forth by Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, meaning the withholding of new investment in an economy. And it's a formal version of what is informally known as a white flight, the migration of white middle-class populations to more racially homogeneous areas. Neoreactionarism does not disavow this racial dimension, but in its incentive-based techno-monarchy, and now I'm quoting Park McDougall, if a person doesn't produce quantifiable value, they are objectively not valuable. Everything else is sentimentality. For neoreaction, whiteness is an abstraction, which does not necessitate white people. It can be performed by nerdy Asians or by artificial intelligence. Whereas most of the alt-right would argue for planetary apartheid, ethno-nationalism, as they put it, neoreaction believes that the genetically self-filtering elite is already in the process of divorcing itself from those of average and below average intelligence in a process that will ultimately lead to a transhuman super race and to quote again Park McDougall, a powerful leader making use of artificial intelligence enhancement technology, putting himself in an unassailable position. In other words, neoreaction, unlike most of the alt-right, would gladly shed underperforming whites and or see California succeed from the United States, as well as welcome competing Govcorps on the same landmass. Again, the point is not to say that neoreaction is fundamentally non-fascist, but that neoreaction forces us to rethink the articulation of fascism and collectivism. But, and here we could also hark back to the talk that Giovanna just gave, clearly the fascist collective was always predicated on segregation of one form or another, and here, or in neoreaction, the social divide that will be, or the form that this segregation will undertake, will be the divide between winners and losers. In a recent article for Salvage, Harrison Fluss and Landon Frim addressed the friction between these opposing poles as a struggle between the competing animal spirits, Behemoth and Leviathan. Whereas Behemoth represents the territorial integrity of ethno-nations, the Leviathan, a sea monster or serpentine whalefish, represents what Carl Schmitt called corsair capitalism, the fluid dynamism of trade and finance. For Schmitt, the Leviathan stood for the thalassocratic power of the British Empire, which he contrasted to the earthbound German Reich. But rather than antagonistic forces, Behemoth and Leviathan could be construed as the different aspects or different facets of the same political body. Think, for instance, of Saudi Arabia, which is at once a racial autocracy and a global financial mover. Or as successive states, and to quote from Frin, as the high seas have given way to cyberspace as the dynamic site of accumulation, the Leviathan could be said to represent an accelerated form of capitalism in the process of abolishing the historical factors which originally allowed it to flourish, hence the frogs, the serpents, and the basilisk. Liminal animals stand at the threshold between two different identities, or at the intersection of different worlds. They are protean boundary beings whose morphology is metaphor incarnate. Deviancy, reversal of hierarchies, or dissolution of order are apostatized onto the jelly-like amphibian body, a stand-in for the liminal experience the whole planet is undergoing. The play between the sticky and the slippery, the paradoxical mix of arcane mysteries, pop idioms, and common sense which populate the far-right forum, all seem to have incubated in nerd culture before compromising it beyond redemption. But as Alexander Reed Ross notes, fascism always had a spectral or syncretic quality, extremely apt at combining positions not typically understood as commensurate. As a non-committal mode of expression, irony could be construed as the rhetorical correlate of the liminal animal. By tacitly implying the opposite of what is literally said, ironic commentary allows one to sustain a position of moral or political ambivalence, to have one foot in each world, if you will. The alt-right usage of irony proved challenging for the segments of the left traditionally invested in the term transgression. Often used to express skepticism, irony has long been perceived as a tool of subversion, the locus of a questioning attitude and critical stand, as Angela Nagel put it, which is hence aligned with political progressiveness. And irony can indeed allow one to express distrust or dissent under taxing or outright perilous circumstances that preclude other forms of political expression. But irony can also mask forms of complicity. Psychoanalytically speaking, irony minimizes its object while maximizing the subject's self-contentment and sense of superiority. Above all, irony is a defense mechanism. It allows one to dodge responsibility for his or her choices, aesthetic or otherwise, to again quote Angela Nagel, opening a toxic conduit between a nonconformist ethos, armchair esoterica, and outright racism. The techno-capitalist spirit, as Flusson from sustain, is in this sense, and I quote, decidedly Faustian, not Promethean. It does not seek to emancipate human beings and better their state, but rather to dominate and distinguish itself from the merely human, end quote. So I would argue that if, as Walter Benjamin argued, every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution, one could say that the rise of crypto-fascist tendencies within the tech industry bears witness to the failure of the digital revolution, whose promise of post-scarcity and socialized capital never came to pass. Now, though a transhuman hyperrace might seem far from likely, existing technology is already immersing us in the radical disruption proffered by civil libertarian doctrine. Just think how the gig economy skirts the social contract. There is also a hidden racial dimension to the codification of technology as a forward unidirectional moment. The alignment of technology and futurity tends to totalize the global as a frictionless space of total connectivity that is ultimately located in free zones and smart cities rather than on a simultaneity of different temporalities, a view which basically devalues the experience of non-whites as underdeveloped and backward. And though all forms of social organization predicated on the privatization of property give rise to a class relation, as Mackenzie Ward noted a long time ago, private property is not synonymous with capitalism, and the class relations that emerge out of the digital turn are not necessarily relations between wage labor and capital. The digital economy changes the process through which technology is accumulated as capital, and the resulting class relation is at odds with the reproduction of social life, at least as we currently organize it. The crucial question, thus, regarding machine learning is the question of ownership. Who owns artificial intelligence? To let the private sector, and at this moment Amazon, Google, which just bought DeepMind, Facebook, IBM, and Microsoft, are the sole proprietors of all artificial intelligence research, yield the authority of the inscrutable, leads to a dramatic restoration of corporate profit and elite power, and whatever we choose to call it, digital feudalism, klepto-fascism, post-democracy, Having private companies as the sole providers of essential public services like healthcare or urban management implies a fundamental division between the winners and losers of the digital turn. That is, a fundamental division between the tech-savvy gentry who devote their lives to the basilisk and a vast underclass of underemployed or precariously employed who are further degraded by the basilisk. Now, not all social tensions find political expression. They do, however, take up a form. They align themselves with or attach themselves to objects, idioms, or tropes. And ideology is the name we give to narratives that do not cohere rationally, but rather aesthetically or emotionally. Just to paraphrase Laurent Berlin, desire always finds its objects, even at the cost of massive misrecognition. And like all commodities, artificial intelligence speaks the idiom of the fetish. It decontextualizes event into pure Terminator-like form. Thus, saturated with paranoid urgency, nihilism, and phobophilia, the basilisk is yet another socially sanctioned narrative in which male aggression accrues cultural capital and, by extension, economic value. Now, just to conclude very briefly, paraphrasing Dmitry Shostakovich on joining the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, one cannot vote for Trump ironically. One can vote for Trump sincerely, or one can vote for Trump cynically. In 2003, Frederick Jameson famously said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. The mix of cyber obscurantism, far-right esoterica, and paranoid ideation, so popular online, could be read as a symptom, not simply in the sense of a ciphered message. The symptom, according to Jacques Lacan, is a sexual act. It can only be defined as the way in which each subject enjoys the unconscious, though this enjoyment is not experienced as enjoyment. For a vast part of the mostly white and relatively affluent population, unburdened by centuries of persecution, the end of the world is, unconsciously or semi-consciously, preferable to the end of capitalism. And under the multidimensional pressures of degrowth, changing demographics, and climate crisis, this group will cast their lot with the basilisk, not in spite of its genocidal nature, but precisely because of it. Thank you. I did not. I will save this for the discussion because I didn't have the time to really comment on each image. But just very briefly, as an aside, you clearly see that there is a resurgence or a revival of this like old anti-Semitic tropes within neo-reaction and the alt-right. This is a Nazi poster that conflates Marxist and finance, which obviously, like high finance means Jews. And here you have one of the memes that is circulating now that seeks to unmask George Soros as the sole funder of Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And this is like former Republican Representative Jack Kingston posting on Twitter, also under the hashtags of all of this conspiracy series, Soros Resistance, Antifa, DNC, then says that the Democratic National Committee. But we can discuss this on the forum.
Thank you so much, Anna. I have no idea how you don't go absolutely mad researching these images in such depth.
These are the softer ones, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much for not putting us through that then. We've got about 5 minutes for questions now for Giovanna and Anna. So if anyone has a question, there are, I believe, handheld microphones here.
Hello, Anna. I would like to approach Anna. Thank you for the lecture. I also really enjoy your text in Text des Zukunft, or however you say it. And I think it's a tricky question, but I'm gonna go for it. Daniel Keller in his.
I cannot see you. Sorry. Hello.
Yeah. Hi. Daniel Keller, in his lecture about the basilisk, ends proposing that the way of fighting the new right wing is with a mirror, right? The way of destroying the basilisk is playing with their same tactics. Can you comment on this?
Well, I mean, of course, like, I would say no, obviously not, because of course, like, this only adds to it, you know, it doesn't subtract from it. Like, you cannot, you cannot ignore the alt-right because the attention economy doesn't run on the same, you know, like, of course, like, this kind of, like, fantasy that, you know, like, by ignoring a problem, it doesn't exist. It's very Freudian, no? Like, it always reminds me of the question of the child that covers its eyes, you know, whatever it is that is threatening you in the dark, if you don't see it, it's not there and it will not hurt you. You don't know that? Because you just made this, like, interesting face. No, but I would say that the question of mimicry as already, like, being theorized abundantly, and of course, like, I always find that affirmational strategies tend to precisely, like, add to whatever it is that they are affirming. They do not subtract from it. And that, you know, like, if you try to mimic the strategies of the alt-right, you will become the alt-right. You will not build, like, you know, like, you will not build any kind of, like, political alternative. I mean, there's also, like, you know, one can unpack the question of, like, what is a mimi? And of course, like, the very concept of mimi is already, like, something that springs from evolutionary biology. So it's already something that is completely implicated in this racialized discourse. I mean, I don't, maybe we can resume this a little bit later when we have the plenary discussion, because I don't want to take up all this time now, right? But yeah, but we can definitely have, like, a longer discussion about this topic.